Before the beginning, there was something. Not nothing, not an empty void waiting to be filled, not darkness, because darkness is the absence of light, and light had not yet been created. Not space, because space is a property of the universe, and the universe did not yet exist. Not time, because time is a dimension of the physical world, and the physical world had not begun. Before the beginning, there was something that the human mind has never been able to adequately describe. That every theological tradition that has ever seriously engaged with this question has eventually been forced to admit lies beyond the reach of human language, and that the opening words of the Bible gesture toward with a casualness that, when you stop and actually think about it, is one of the most extraordinary moments in the history of human writing. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. In the beginning, not before the beginning, not from the beginning, in the beginning, which means that the beginning had a beginning, which means that whatever God is, God was there before the beginning began, which means that whatever God was doing, whatever God was being in the state that existed before time and space and matter and energy and everything we mean by the word existence came into being, is a question that the Bible opens with and then almost immediately stops answering. Almost, but not quite. Because if you know where to look, if you know how to read the texts that the mainstream religious traditions have largely kept in the background, if you know what the mystics and the philosophers and the theologians who pushed hardest against the limits of human thought about God actually found when they pushed, the answer that emerges is one of the most extraordinary and most unsettling ideas in the history of human religious thought. God, before the creation, was not doing nothing. God was not waiting. God was not alone in any simple sense. And the creation of the world was not the first act of a being who had previously existed in perfect static isolation. It was the external expression of something that had been happening internally within the divine being itself for what we can only inadequately describe as an eternity before time existed. And the traces of that internal divine life, preserved in the oldest layers of the biblical text, in the Jewish mystical tradition, in the early Christian theological debates, in Islamic philosophical theology, and in traditions that most people have never heard of, point towards something that the mainstream traditions have never been entirely comfortable discussing. Something was happening before the beginning, and what was happening changes everything about what we think we know about who God is. Welcome to this channel where ancient secrets meet modern questions. To understand the question of who God was before the creation, you first need to understand why this question is so difficult and why the mainstream religious traditions have been simultaneously drawn to it and frightened of it. The difficulty is not merely intellectual, it is structural. Every tool we have for thinking about anything, every concept, every word, every category of thought, was developed by human beings who exist inside time and space and the physical universe. When we try to think about something that exists outside time and space and the physical universe, we are trying to use tools that were designed for one job to do a completely different job. It is like trying to use a ruler to measure temperature. The instrument is not wrong, it is simply the wrong instrument for the task. The philosopher Immanuel Kant identified this problem with great precision in his Critique of Pure Reason. He argued that the human mind applies certain fundamental categories, including time, space, and causality, to all of its experience. We cannot think without these categories. But these categories are features of human experience, not features of reality as it is in itself. When we try to think about what exists outside time, outside space, outside causality, we are trying to apply categories that do not apply. The result is not error, exactly. It is the recognition of a limit. Every serious theologian in every major tradition has eventually hit this limit. And the responses to hitting the limit have been remarkably similar across traditions that had no direct contact with each other, which is itself one of the most interesting facts about the history of human religious thought. One response is what theologians call the apophatic or negative theology, the approach that says the only honest thing we can say about God is what God is not. God is not finite. God is not limited by time. God is not limited by space. God is not one being among other beings. God is not subject to change. God is not dependent on anything outside God. By stripping away every attribute that belongs to the created world, by saying, not this, not this, not this, the apophatic tradition arrives at something that it acknowledges cannot be described, only approached through the systematic negation of everything that can be described. This tradition appears in Jewish thought in the work of Maimonides, who argued in his Guide for the Perplexed that all positive attributes of God are ultimately inadequate, and that the most honest theology is one that says what God is not rather than what God is. It appears in Christian thought in the work of Pseudo Dionysius the Areopagite, a 6th century Christian mystic whose influence on medieval theology was enormous, who described God as the divine darkness, the reality that transcends all human categories, including the category of being itself. It appears in Islamic thought in the Kalam tradition and in the Sufi mystical tradition, particularly in the work of Ibn Arabi, the 13th century Andalusian mystic who developed one of the most sophisticated apophatic theologies in the history of any religion. All of these traditions converge on the same impossible conclusion: God before the creation is not just unknown. God before the creation is unknowable, not because of a failure of human intelligence, but because the knower and the known are both creatures of time and the thing being sought is not. And yet, the traditions did not stop there, because the apophatic approach, honest as it is about the limits of human knowledge, leaves a question unanswered that will not stay unanswered. If God is the creator, if God chose to create, if the act of creation was in some sense a free act of a being who could have not created, then something about God's own inner life, God's own inner reality before the creation, must be relevant to understanding why the creation happened at all. A perfectly static, perfectly self sufficient, perfectly isolated divine being has no reason to create, and yet the creation happened. Which means something about God's inner reality before the creation was oriented toward the creation. And what that something was is the question that drives the most extraordinary theological speculation in the history of all three Abrahamic traditions. Let us start with the Hebrew Bible itself, because the question of what it reveals about God before the creation is more complex and more surprising than most readers of the text realize. The opening word of the Hebrew Bible is Bereshit, in the beginning. The rabbis noted very early that the text does not say God was in the beginning, it says, in the beginning, God created. The being of God is not explained or located in the beginning. The beginning is when God's creative activity started. What God was before the beginning is simply not addressed in the opening verse. But the rabbinic tradition did not let this silence stand without examination. The Midrash Bereshit Rabbah, one of the oldest collections of rabbinic biblical interpretation, contains a remarkable exchange. One of the rabbis asks, "What was God doing before the creation?" And another rabbi answers, "God was building worlds and destroying them." This is an extraordinary answer. It suggests that the creation we know is not the first creation, that before our universe existed, other universes were created and found wanting and unmade. That the God who made our world is a God with a history of creative activity that predates our existence. The Kabbalistic tradition would later develop this idea into one of the most sophisticated cosmological theories in the history of religious thought. The Hebrew text of Genesis also contains, in its very first verse, a grammatical and textual anomaly that has been the subject of intense rabbinic analysis for 2,000 years. The word for God in Genesis 1-1 is Elohim, which is grammatically plural. The Hebrew text says, literally, in the beginning the gods created, though the verb bara, created, is singular, indicating that Elohim here is functioning as a singular noun. Why is the word for God in the first verse of the Bible plural in form? The mainstream explanations have been various. Some argue it is a plural of majesty, like the royal we, in which a singular being uses plural language to indicate grandeur. Some argue it reflects an older polytheistic background that was reinterpreted in a monotheistic direction. Some argue it points towards something in the divine nature itself, a plurality within the unity that the text is encoding rather than explaining. The Christian theological tradition seized on the plural Elohim as one piece of evidence for the doctrine of the Trinity, the claim that the one God exists as three persons. The rabbinic tradition rejected this interpretation, but did not dismiss the question of what the plural form was doing there. And the Kabbalistic tradition developed an answer that is, in its own way, as radical as the Trinitarian answer, though pointing in a different direction. Here is where the Jewish mystical tradition, the Kabbalah, enters the story. And what it has to say about God before the creation is so extraordinary that it deserves extended treatment because it is the most sustained and most sophisticated attempt in any tradition to actually answer the question of who God was before the world began. The Kabbalistic tradition, which reached its most systematic formulation in the Zohar, a 13th century text from the circle of Moses de Leon in Castile, and was further developed by the 16th century mystic Isaac Luria in Safed, begins its account of God's inner life with a concept that has no equivalent in mainstream Jewish or Christian or Islamic theology. The concept of Ein Sof. Ein Sof means without end or infinite. It is the Kabbalistic name for God, as God is in God's own essential being, before any act of creation, before any self-disclosure, before any relationship with anything outside God. The Ein Sof is not a being among other beings. It is not a personal God who speaks and commands and loves and judges. It is the infinite ground of being itself, the reality that is prior to and the source of everything that exists, but which in its own nature is entirely beyond description, beyond knowledge, beyond relationship. The Ein Sof cannot be prayed to in any direct sense, because prayer requires a relationship between two parties, and the Ein Sof in its own nature admits of no relationship. There is nothing outside the Ein Sof for it to be in relationship with. This is an almost Buddhist conception of ultimate reality, and the parallel has been noted by scholars who work across traditions. The Ein Sof has remarkable similarities to the Buddhist concept of sunyata, emptiness, or to the Taoist concept of the Tao that cannot be named. In all of these traditions, the ultimate reality is not a being, but the ground of being, not a thing, but the condition for the possibility of all things. But the Kabbalistic tradition does not stop at the Ein Sof. Because if the Ein Sof is entirely beyond relationship, entirely beyond description, entirely beyond any activity or self-disclosure, then how did the world come to exist? How did an absolutely infinite, absolutely undifferentiated, absolutely self-enclosed reality produce a universe of finite, differentiated, relational beings? The answer the Kabbalah gives is one of the most extraordinary theological ideas in the history of human religious thought, the Tzimtzum. The Tzimtzum, a concept developed by Isaac Luria in 16th century Safed, means contraction or withdrawal. Luria's teaching is that the first act of creation was not an act of God going outward, expanding, expressing, emanating. It was an act of God going inward, contracting, withdrawing, making space. The infinite Ein Sof, in order to make room for a finite world contracted within itself, pulling its infinite being back from a conceptual space in which the finite world could exist. The creation of the world was preceded by a kind of divine self-limitation, a making room, a holding back of infinite being, so that finite being could have somewhere to be. This idea has fascinated theologians and philosophers and physicists who have encountered it. The theologian Jürgen Moltmann of Tübingen University, one of the most influential Protestant theologians of the 20th century, developed in his work The Trinity and the Kingdom a theology of divine self-limitation that draws explicitly on the Lurianic Tzimtzum. Moltmann argues that the creation of the world required God to make space within God's own being for something other than God to exist, and that this divine self-limitation is an expression of God's love, the willingness to be less than infinite in order to make room for the beloved. The physicist and theologian John Polkinghorne, who was both a Fellow of the Royal Society and an Anglican priest, found in the Tzimtzum concept a striking resonance with modern cosmological thinking about the fine-tuned parameters of the physical universe. The universe appears to be set up in a way that allows for complexity in life and consciousness to exist, and the question of why those parameters are what they are has generated a substantial literature in physics and philosophy. The Kabbalistic answer that the space for finite existence was made by a divine act of self-limitation is not a scientific theory, but it addresses the same fundamental question that the fine-tuning argument in cosmology addresses. Why is there room for us? But before the Tzimtzum, in the Kabbalistic account, what was happening? If the Ein Sof was perfectly infinite and perfectly undifferentiated, was anything happening at all? The Zohar addresses this question with language that is simultaneously poetic and technically precise. It describes the pre-creation state of the Ein Sof as a state of perfect rest, but not the rest of inactivity. It is the rest of a kind of inner life that has no external expression, an interior movement within the divine being that is entirely self-contained and self-sufficient. The Zohar uses the image of a spark hidden within the most hidden, an inner light that exists within the Ein Sof before any external expression. This inner light is not yet the light of creation. It is the divine life as it exists within itself before any outward movement. The Sephirot, the 10 divine attributes or emanations that the Kabbalistic tradition describes as the structure of the divine being in its self-disclosure, are in their ultimate origin hidden within the Ein Sof before the creation. The qualities of wisdom and understanding and love and judgment and beauty and eternity and splendor and foundation and kingdom that constitute the Kabbalistic map of the divine nature are not external to God. They are the inner structure of the divine life itself, and they were there, hidden within the Ein Sof, before the creation gave them external expression. This is a remarkable answer to the question of who God was before the creation. God was, in God's own inner life, a richness of being, a complexity of inner relationship, a dynamic of inner life that had no external expression. The creation was not God going from nothing to something. It was God going from internal to external, from hidden to revealed, from potential to actual. The world exists because God's inner life overflowed into external expression. Or, in the language of the Tzimtzum, God made space so that the overflow could happen somewhere other than within the infinite. Now let us cross to the Christian tradition, because the Christian answer to the question of who God was before the creation is structurally similar to the Kabbalistic answer, but reaches the same conclusion by a different path through the doctrine of the Trinity. The doctrine of the Trinity, which was formally defined at the Council of Nicaea in 325 CE and further elaborated at the Council of Constantinople in 381 CE, holds that the one God exists as three persons: Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. The persons are distinct but not separate. They share one divine substance or essence, and their relationship to each other is not a relationship that began at the creation. It is an eternal relationship that has always existed within the divine being itself. This is the Christian answer to the question of what God was doing before the creation. God was being the Trinity. God was the eternal relationship of Father and Son and Holy Spirit, a relationship of love and knowledge and mutual self-giving that has no beginning and no end because it exists outside time. The creation was not the beginning of God's relational life. It was the extension of God's relational life outward, the inclusion of creatures in the love that had always existed within the divine being. The theologian Augustine of Hippo, in his masterwork De Trinitate, explores the inner life of the Trinity with extraordinary philosophical precision. He argues that the Father's eternal knowledge of himself generates the Son, the divine word or logos, as the perfect expression of that self-knowledge. And the love between the Father and the Son is itself a person, the Holy Spirit. The inner life of God is therefore not a static self-sufficiency, but a dynamic of knowledge and love between persons, an eternal movement of self-giving and reception that constitutes the divine life before and apart from any creation. This Augustinian framework was further developed by the medieval theologian Richard of St. Victor, who argued that perfect love requires a beloved, and that if God is perfect love, then God must have a beloved within God's own being from all eternity. The Son is God's eternal beloved, and the love between Father and Son is itself the Spirit. Before the creation, God was not alone. God was the eternal community of love. The theologian David Bentley Hart, in his work The Beauty of the Infinite, argues that the Christian doctrine of the Trinity is the most radical possible answer to the question of why God created. God did not create because God needed something. God did not create because God was lonely or bored or incomplete. God created out of the overflow of a love that was already infinitely complete within the divine life itself. The creation is not God's answer to a problem. It is God's gift, an invitation to participate in a love that was already perfect and already complete. This framework also answers one of the most persistent questions in philosophical theology: why is there something rather than nothing? The standard philosophical answer is that if God is perfectly self-sufficient, God has no reason to create anything at all. A perfect being needs nothing outside itself. The Trinitarian answer is that God did not create out of need but out of love, and love by its nature tends to overflow, to include, to give itself to what is other than itself. The creation is not a product of divine necessity, it is a product of divine generosity. The Islamic philosophical tradition approaches the same question from a different angle, and its answer reveals both the similarities and the differences between the three Abrahamic traditions on this deepest of theological questions. Islam's most fundamental theological commitment is to the absolute unity of God, Tawhid, a unity so radical that it seems to exclude the kind of internal divine plurality that the Kabbalistic tradition describes through the Sephirot and the Christian tradition describes through the Trinity. The Quran is insistent. Say God is one, God the eternal. He neither begets nor is begotten, and there is none comparable to him. This is the most explicit rejection of Trinitarian theology in the text of any of the three traditions, and it reflects an understanding of divine unity that has no room for internal distinctions within the divine being. And yet, the Islamic philosophical tradition, particularly in its mystical Sufi dimension, found itself wrestling with the same question. If God is perfectly one, perfectly self-sufficient, perfectly beyond all relationship, why did God create? What was happening in the divine being before the creation that oriented it toward the creation? The answer that the Sufi tradition, particularly in the work of Ibn Arabi, developed is one of the most remarkable in the history of Islamic thought. Ibn Arabi describes a state of divine being before the creation that he calls the hidden treasure, drawing on a famous hadith, a saying attributed to the Prophet Muhammad that says, I was a hidden treasure and I wanted to be known, so I created creation so that I might be known. The authenticity of this hadith is disputed by Islamic scholars. It does not appear in the most rigorously authenticated collections. But its influence on Islamic mystical theology has been enormous, precisely because it provides an answer to the otherwise intractable question of why God created. God created because God wanted to be known. The creation is the expression of a divine desire for self-disclosure, a desire that existed within the divine being before the creation, but that could only be fulfilled through a creation capable of knowing God. Ibn Arabi developed this into a full theological system in which the names and attributes of God, his knowledge, his will, his power, his mercy, his justice, existed within the divine being before the creation as a kind of inner plurality within the absolute unity of the divine essence. The creation is the actualization of these divine names, the arena in which the infinite richness of the divine being is expressed in finite forms. Before the creation, God was the hidden treasure. After the creation, God is the disclosed reality, known through and in the creation that reflects the divine names. This is remarkably similar to the Kabbalistic account of the Sephirot hidden within the Ein Sof before the creation. And it raises the same question that the Kabbalistic account raises. If there is internal plurality within the divine being, even a plurality of names and attributes, is that plurality genuine or is it only apparent? Is God truly and absolutely one, or is the divine unity a unity of a more complex kind than simple singularity? The mainstream Islamic theological tradition has insisted on the former. The divine unity is absolute, and the plurality of names is a plurality in our description of God, not in God's own being. The Sufi tradition has pushed toward a more nuanced answer, one that sounds remarkably like the apophatic tradition in Judaism and Christianity. The truth about God's inner life before the creation is beyond human categories, and all our descriptions, including the description of absolute unity, are ultimately inadequate to the reality they are trying to describe. Now, step back and look at what all three traditions have found when they pushed hardest against this question. The Jewish Kabbalistic tradition found the Ein Sof, an infinite divine being whose inner life before the creation was a richness of hidden qualities that overflowed into the creation through an act of divine self-limitation. The Christian Trinitarian tradition found the eternal community of Father and Son and Spirit, whose inner life of love overflowed into the creation as an act of divine generosity. The Islamic Sufi tradition found the hidden treasure, a divine being whose inner desire to be known expressed itself in a creation capable of knowing it. Three different answers, three different theological vocabularies, three different sets of conceptual tools, and yet they converge on the same basic structure. Before the creation, God's inner life was not static, not simple, not empty. It was a richness of being, a dynamic of inner life that the creation externalized and expressed. And here is the thing that none of the traditions is entirely comfortable saying, but that all of them, when pushed to their limits, seem to be pointing toward the creation was not an accident. It was not a whim. It was not the product of boredom or loneliness or need. It was the natural expression of something that was already fully present in the divine being before the first word of Genesis was spoken. The world exists because God's inner life required external expression. Or, in the language of Ibn Arabi's hidden treasure, the world exists because God wanted to be known. And if the world exists because God wanted to be known, then the entire history of human religious seeking, the entire tradition of human beings looking for God across every culture and every century and every tradition is not a one-sided search. It is a mutual recognition. The human being looking for God is the creation looking back at its source. And the source was already, before the creation began, oriented toward this moment of recognition. Here is the question I want to leave you with, the one that this entire investigation has been building toward, and that I think deserves more of your attention than you have probably given it. If God before the creation was not doing nothing, if the divine inner life before the creation was already a richness of being that the creation was going to express, then what does it mean for you, for your specific existence in this specific moment, that the God who made the world made it in order to be known?